For years, Steven Seagal cultivated the image of an untouchable action icon. On screen, he was calm, unstoppable, and always in control. His characters rarely raised their voices. They didn't need to. A quiet stare, a sudden move, and the fight was over. To audiences in the late 80s and 90s, Seagal represented a specific fantasy: effortless dominance. A man so skilled, so centered, that violence bent around him. But off camera, that image slowly collapsed. And nowhere is that collapse more visible than in the reactions of his own peers. Because in Hollywood, where fake smiles are currency and grudges are usually buried, something unusual happened. A growing list of actors didn't just criticize Steven Seagal. They refused to respect him. Some refused to work with him. Others made it clear they wanted nothing to do with him at all. This is the story of the actors who openly hate Steven Seagal, and why his reputation among celebrities became so toxic that many wouldn't even look at him. It didn't start with hatred. It started with discomfort. On film sets, Seagal quickly developed a reputation for behavior that made people uneasy. He didn't collaborate. He dictated. He ignored choreography, dismissed stunt coordinators, and often treated co-stars as obstacles rather than partners. For younger actors or newcomers, this created an immediate power imbalance. Speaking up meant risking your career. Staying silent meant enduring humiliation. Many chose silence, at least at first. But over time, the stories began to leak out. And once they did, they all pointed in the same direction. One of the earliest and most revealing accounts came from John Leguizamo. During rehearsals for Executive Decision, Seagal reportedly announced to the cast that he was in charge and that what he said was law. Leguizamo initially laughed, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. What followed was a sudden physical encounter where Seagal allegedly slammed him against a wall using a martial arts move, knocking the air out of him. Leguizamo later recalled gasping for breath, confused and shocked, repeatedly asking why. The incident wasn't framed as a rehearsal mistake or an accident. It was dominance. And that distinction matters. Because in Hollywood, accidents are forgiven. Power plays are not. Leguizamo didn't bury the story. He told it publicly, repeatedly. He told it with humor, but the message underneath was clear. He didn't respect Seagal, and he wasn't afraid of him. That alone was unusual. Most actors avoid publicly antagonizing other actors, especially ones with established franchises. But Leguizamo seemed almost eager to puncture the myth. And he wasn't alone. The myth suffered its most devastating blow on the set of Out for Justice. By that point, Seagal had a habit of boasting about his martial arts abilities, particularly his claim that no one could put him in a chokehold. According to multiple accounts, he insisted that his control techniques made him immune. That claim didn't sit well with Gene LeBell, a legendary stuntman and martial artist known throughout Hollywood as the godfather of stunt performers. LeBell wasn't a loud man. He didn't boast. He simply accepted the challenge. What happened next became one of the most infamous moments in action movie history. LeBell applied a chokehold, and within seconds, Seagal lost consciousness. Witnesses later claimed that the humiliation didn't end there. Some said Seagal lost control of his body as he went out. The story spread fast, and it stuck. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just that Seagal was beaten. It was who beat him. LeBell wasn't a rival actor. He wasn't seeking fame. He was widely respected, feared even, within the stunt community. And crucially, he never loudly denied the story. He didn't need to. Others on set backed it up. For many actors, this was the moment the illusion shattered. The invincible action star wasn't invincible. He wasn't even particularly impressive. He was just loud. Years later, Ronda Rousey would pour gasoline on that fire. As a former UFC champion and someone trained by Gene LeBell himself, Rousey didn't just question Seagal's skills. She mocked them. When Seagal dismissed the chokehold story and insulted LeBell, Rousey responded with open hostility. She said that if Seagal ever spoke badly about her mentor in her presence, she'd make him soil himself again. It was a brutal statement, but it resonated because it wasn't just trash talk. It was loyalty, and it was backed by real credentials. Rousey had nothing to gain from attacking Seagal. She did it because she genuinely despised him. Other actors expressed their disdain more bluntly. Charlize Theron, an Oscar-winning actress known for performing her own stunts, didn't mince words when asked about Seagal. In a radio interview, she dismissed his martial arts demonstrations as ridiculous, describing him as overweight and barely capable of fighting. She went further, referencing the long list of allegations made by women against him. She made it clear she had no problem speaking openly because, in her words, he wasn't good with women. That statement wasn't casual. It was a line in the sand. Theron didn't just dislike Seagal professionally. She rejected him morally. And then there were the women who described encounters so disturbing that hatred almost feels like too mild a word. Jenny McCarthy recounted an audition where Seagal allegedly pressured her to undress, claiming there were nude scenes when there were none. When she refused, she said he became aggressive and tried to intimidate her into silence. She ran out of the room in tears. Years later, she still stood by the story. She had no reason not to. By then, she was already successful. Her career didn't depend on him. What she wanted was accountability. Portia de Rossi shared an even more shocking account. During a final audition, she alleged that Seagal pulled down his leather pants while telling her that off-screen chemistry was important. She fled. When she told her agent, the response was chillingly indifferent. That moment stayed with her for years. Eventually, during the height of the Me Too movement, she decided to make it public. The response was immediate. Support poured in. And once again, Seagal said nothing that could meaningfully refute the claim. Julianne Margulies described a meeting that terrified her. Invited to a hotel room under the pretense of discussing a role, she found herself alone with Seagal. At one point, she felt something hard under a couch cushion. When she stood up, Seagal produced a gun and casually remarked that he must have left it there. Margulies, who had never seen a real firearm up close, was shaken. She left as quickly as she could. She later said she made sure never to be alone with him again on set. That kind of fear doesn't come from misunderstanding. It comes from instinct. Pamela Anderson, another major star of the era, also distanced herself. She revealed that Seagal invited her to his hotel room to discuss a potential role. When she arrived and saw him sitting on the bed, she immediately felt something was wrong. She declined the role and avoided further interaction. Years later, she said her intuition had saved her. That statement carried weight, especially when placed alongside the growing list of similar stories. What's striking is not just the number of accusations, but the consistency. Hotel rooms, power imbalance, boundary violations, intimidation. This pattern became impossible to ignore. And among actors, patterns matter more than rumors. Hollywood is built on whispers, yes, but it's also built on risk calculation. And Steven Seagal became a risk. Male co-stars weren't immune to his behavior either. Randy Couture, a respected fighter and actor, described Seagal as brutal and disrespectful towards stunt performers. He spoke of unnecessary injuries and a constant need to prove dominance. Brian Cox, one of the most respected actors in the industry, wrote in his memoirs that Seagal lived in a bubble of arrogance, completely detached from reality. Cox recalled tension on set, inflexibility, and a refusal to take direction or suggestions. These weren't emotional outbursts. They were calm observations from professionals who had worked with countless difficult personalities and still singled Seagal out as exceptional. Even actors who shared scenes with him and tried to remain neutral eventually cracked. DMX, who worked with Seagal on multiple projects, publicly criticized his attitude, describing him as arrogant and exhausting to work with. Script changes, unreasonable demands, and a constant sense of chaos surrounded him. Stephen Tobolowsky recalled confusion on the set of The Glimmer Man, driven by Seagal's unilateral decisions that disrupted continuity and frustrated the entire crew. Perhaps the most telling example of industry-wide disdain came from Saturday Night Live. Hosting the show is usually a sign that an actor has reached a level of cultural acceptance. For Seagal, it became a disaster. According to cast members and writers, he didn't understand the jokes, refused to perform sketches that poked fun at him, and blocked the creative process. Tim Meadows later said Seagal was one of the worst hosts in the show's history. Lorne Michaels himself reportedly agreed. The The message was clear. Seagal couldn't laugh at himself. And in comedy, that's unforgivable. Over time, this collective rejection hardened into something stronger than dislike. It became avoidance. Actors didn't just criticize Seagal. They stopped engaging with him altogether. They didn't defend him. They didn't collaborate. They didn't invite him into their circles. In an industry where alliances are everything, isolation is a death sentence. And that's the final irony. Steven Seagal built his career on the image of a lone warrior, a man apart from the world. But in reality, it was the world that stepped away from him. Not because he was misunderstood, not because he was too intense, but because too many people had seen behind the curtain. They saw the bullying, the arrogance, the fear he inspired not through respect, but through intimidation. And once that image took hold, it couldn't be undone. Today, Seagal's name doesn't evoke admiration among his peers. It evokes eye rolls, silence, or, in some cases, open contempt. Actors who hate Steven Seagal don't hate him because of rumors. They hate him because they experienced him. And in Hollywood, where image is everything, that might be the most damning verdict of all. But the resentment didn't end with avoidance. In some cases, it turned into outright refusal. There are actors who made it clear, privately and publicly, that they would never share a frame with Steven Seagal again. Not because of scheduling conflicts, not because of creative differences, but because they didn't trust him. And in an industry built on trust that your scene partner won't hurt you, humiliate you, or cross lines, that kind of reputation is fatal. Behind the scenes, casting directors quietly learned to stop suggesting his name. Producers learned that attaching Seagal to a project could scare off talent. Crew members would request transfers. Stunt teams approached his films with apprehension rather than excitement. The mood shifted. What was once a draw became a liability, and the actors noticed. There's a reason so many of the stories about Seagal come with the same emotional undercurrent: disbelief. People weren't shocked by his arrogance alone. Hollywood is full of egos. What shocked them was how openly he displayed it, how little he cared about the comfort or safety of others, and how convinced he seemed of his own untouchability. That kind of behavior might go unchallenged for a while, especially when box office numbers are strong. But eventually, the industry corrects itself. The correction often comes not through lawsuits or formal consequences, but through something colder and more permanent: social exile. Phone calls stop being returned. Invitations dry up. Scripts don't arrive. Meetings don't happen. And for an actor whose persona depends on relevance and fear-based respect, that silence is devastating. What makes this story even more striking is how consistently the actors who criticize Seagal share one trait: they didn't need him. These weren't desperate newcomers seeking attention. These were established figures, people with awards, credibility, and options. When Charlize Theron dismissed him, she did so from a position of unassailable authority. When Ronda Rousey mocked him, she did it backed by real combat experience. When Brian Cox described him as delusional, it landed because Cox has worked with the best and the worst and rarely singles people out without cause. This is why the hatred feels so raw. It's not performative. It's not strategic. It's personal. There's also something deeply symbolic about how Seagal's image collapsed in the age of the internet. In the past, studios could control narratives. Stories could be buried. Now, interviews live forever. Clips circulate endlessly. Audiences can see patterns for themselves. A single anecdote becomes part of a larger mosaic. And once that mosaic is complete, it's impossible to ignore. Seagal's martial arts demonstrations, once treated with reverence, are now dissected with skepticism. Clips meant to inspire awe are recontextualized as parody. Actors and fighters alike point out inconsistencies, staged movements, and compliant partners. The mystique evaporates. And with it, the fear that once kept people quiet. This shift emboldened more voices. People who might have stayed silent a decade earlier began to speak. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. And as more actors expressed disdain, something else happened. The narrative flipped. It was no longer risky to criticize Steven Seagal. It became strange not to. Silence, once a shield, became suspicious. Even those who didn't openly attack him often made their feelings clear through omission. In interviews about past films, co-stars would praise everyone except him. Directors would talk around his name. When asked directly, responses were brief, guarded, or dismissive. In Hollywood, those pauses speak louder than insults. There's a moment that encapsulates this perfectly. When George Foreman, one of the most respected boxers in history, publicly challenged Seagal to a fight, it wasn't because he wanted spectacle. It was because he didn't take Seagal seriously. Foreman was in his late 60s at the time. He wasn't chasing relevance. He was making a point. And the fact that the fight never happened only reinforced the perception that Seagal preferred myth to reality. Jean-Claude Van Damme, another action star often compared to Seagal, also became part of the conversation. While Van Damme has had his own controversies, he never cultivated the same aura of untouchability. He laughed at himself. He acknowledged flaws. And that difference mattered. Audiences noticed. Actors noticed. Respect shifted accordingly. Michael Jai White, a legitimate martial artist and actor, has spoken diplomatically but clearly about Seagal's limitations. He didn't need to insult him. The contrast did the work. When real fighters talk, the room listens. And Seagal's voice grew quieter. What ultimately sealed his fate among actors wasn't any single incident. It was accumulation. The weight of dozens of stories, told independently, over decades, by people who didn't coordinate and didn't benefit. Each account added another crack. Eventually, the structure collapsed. And once that happens in Hollywood, there's no rebuilding. Reinvention requires goodwill. Redemption requires humility. Seagal showed neither. Today, when his name comes up among actors, it's rarely with nostalgia. It's with caution, or humor, or outright contempt. People remember the tension, the fear, the discomfort. They remember warning others. They remember choosing not to return calls. They remember deciding, quietly and collectively, that working with him wasn't worth the cost. Actors who hate Steven Seagal don't hate him because he failed. They hate him because he refused to change. Because he mistook fear for respect. Because he believed his own legend long after everyone else stopped believing. And in an industry that thrives on illusion, that may be the most unforgivable mistake of all. They also remember something else, the silence that followed. Not public silence, but the kind that happens when an industry collectively moves on without you. Steven Seagal didn't disappear overnight. There was no dramatic fall, no single headline that ended everything. Instead, his presence slowly faded. Fewer studio films, smaller budgets, direct-to-video releases filmed far from Hollywood, projects that barely registered culturally. And while some actors managed to reinvent themselves in that phase, Seagal didn't. He doubled down on the same persona, the same mythology, as if sheer insistence could resurrect relevance. But Hollywood had already made its decision. What's telling is how rarely actors come to his defense. In scandals involving other controversial figures, there are often colleagues who step forward to vouch for character, to contextualize behavior, to complicate the narrative. With Seagal, that counterweight is almost non-existent. The silence isn't accidental. It reflects an absence of loyalty. And loyalty, in Hollywood, is earned through respect. Even years later, when his name resurfaces in interviews, the reactions are immediate and revealing. Some actors laugh uncomfortably. Others shut the topic down. A few, emboldened by time and distance, speak freely. And when they do, the tone is rarely ambiguous. There's irritation, disgust, in some cases, genuine anger. These aren't rehearsed answers. They sound like people recalling something they'd rather forget. The refusal to even look at him, metaphorical or literal, isn't about pettiness. It's about boundaries. Many actors learned, through experience or warning, that proximity to Steven Seagal came with consequences. Physical, emotional, professional. Avoidance became self-preservation. And once that pattern takes hold, it spreads quietly. One conversation leads to another. One warning saves someone else from an uncomfortable situation. The network protects itself. That's how reputations truly die in Hollywood. Not through headlines, but through whispered cautions passed from one set to another. There's a bitter irony in how Seagal's on-screen persona clashes with his off-screen legacy. His characters preached discipline, honor, balance. They punished corruption. They defended the vulnerable. But the actors who worked beside him described the opposite. They described chaos instead of discipline, ego instead of honor, intimidation instead of balance. That disconnect made the resentment sharper. People felt deceived, not just by the man, but by the myth that had been sold so convincingly. For many actors, especially those trained in legitimate martial arts or stunt work, Seagal's behavior felt like an insult to the craft. Martial arts, at its core, emphasizes control, respect, and responsibility. Using it to dominate colleagues or assert power violates those principles. That's why the Jean Labelle incident resonates so strongly to this day. It wasn't just about proving skill. It was about exposing hypocrisy. As time passed, Seagal's isolation became more pronounced. Industry events came and went without him. Tributes to action cinema rarely mentioned his name. Younger actors didn't cite him as an influence. When lists of iconic action stars were published, he slipped further down, sometimes omitted entirely. Not because his films never mattered, but because his behavior eclipsed them. And perhaps that's the final reason so many actors hate Steven Seagal. Not dislike, hate, because he squandered something rare. He had visibility, power, and a platform. He could have been remembered as a defining figure of a genre. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when ego goes unchecked and fear replaces respect. In the end, the most damaging judgment didn't come from critics, journalists, or even audiences. It came from the people who knew him best, the actors who shared sets with him, rehearsed with him, trusted him with their safety. When they turned away, when they refused to engage, when they spoke out or stayed conspicuously silent, they delivered a verdict more lasting than any scandal. The story of actors who hate Steven Seagal isn't really about hatred at all. It's about boundaries being crossed too many times, about warnings ignored, about an industry that eventually chose to protect itself, and about a man who believed his own legend so completely that he never noticed when everyone else stopped believing in him. That is where the story ends.